Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Before we dive into today's episode, this is your weekly reminder that if you have not yet liked or subscribed to the podcast, please do so now so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, if you want to leave a rating or a review, that is so helpful for the podcast as well, and just makes it easier for other people to find and be able to listen to the podcast. So, without further ado, we're going to dive into today's podcast topic. We're going to talk about heat and heat illnesses, or dancing in extreme heat. So I know in certain parts of the world, there have been a lot of heat waves going on. And so in some of the dance teacher forums and groups that I'm in, there's been lots of questions kind of circulating with people saying, we don't have AC in the studio. The temperature is predicted to be this. Should we be canceling classes? What should we be doing? Is it safe for dancers to keep dancing? And as a lot of dancers are heading into summer intensives and dancing a lot in places in the world that are quite hot, I thought that this was sort of a timely episode to just get into some things we need to consider specifically for dance teachers and people running programs in the hotter months, and especially more intensive type programs, because a lot of times the type of dancing that dancers are participating in the summer is a little bit more intensive, longer hours than maybe throughout the rest of the dance year. So not only are we contending with hotter temperatures, but also maybe longer hours of dancing. And so we need to consider some of these things. So we're going to talk about what the sort of like signs and symptoms of heat illnesses are, because this is really the most important thing to be aware of if we're dancing in warmer temperatures. Is how do we know if this is just, it's a little bit warm, but everybody's kind of doing okay? Or is this becoming problematic for our dancers? Is this becoming a dangerous situation? Because it absolutely can become a dangerous situation. So heat illnesses get divided into sort of different categories, and you'll hear people refer to heat stroke or heat exhaustion, or sometimes people just use the bigger umbrella term of heat illnesses. But essentially what it is it is on a continuum. And so our body is meant to be maintained at a certain core body temperature, varies slightly from person to person. And if we are exposed to situations or environments that start to challenge that, so hot weather or strenuous activity or both of those things combined, our body starts to struggle to maintain that sort of homeostasis of core body temperature. And we'll start to see that body temperature start to rise a little bit. And there are signs and symptoms that start to present that might tell us that the body is struggling to cope a little bit with staying cool enough or keeping the core body temperature low enough. So, things that we are looking for that might be an indication that people are struggling with managing the heat are excessive sweating. So you'll see people just sweat's like dripping off of them, kind of like really pouring with sweat, excessive sweating. That is the body trying to cool down the core body temperature by producing sweat. That's sort of the first sign. So if we're thinking about like heat exhaustion, that is often something that is present. But if the body continues to struggle and we're progressing more into an even more dangerous situation like a heat stroke, we will sometimes see people lose the ability to sweat. So if they actually stop sweating, so they were sweating, then they stop sweating, that's actually a sign of an even more dangerous scenario. So we really need to be aware of those situations. We'll also sometimes see this excessive sweating, but the person sort of feels like cool and clammy, almost it's like damp and kind of clammy feeling, as opposed to, if you're just dancing and your body is functioning well and managing the stress of that well, we are going to sweat. Sweat's a supernatural process. It's a healthy process. It is how our body tries to maintain core body temperature and things like that. But if we're sweating, but it's kind of like that cool, clammy sweating, that might be a sign of the body, again, struggling a little bit. So we want to be aware of how much people are sweating, and especially, like I said, if they then stop sweating. So all of a sudden, or maybe not all of a sudden, but they progress from potentially excessive sweating to then not being able to sweat, that is definitely a sign of sort of a heat emergency. And we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of heat exhaustion versus heat stroke and what's an emergency and all of that in a second. So sweating, definitely something to keep an eye on. We will often see people complain of headaches or dizziness if they are struggling to cope with the heat. And so that sort of lightheaded, dizzy, headachy type feeling, and nausea is often associated with that as well. So we might have people feeling really, really nauseous from being in that excessive heat. So that's something to watch for if dancers are starting to report kind of those types of symptoms. We will often see high reports of muscle cramping. So if you have dancers who, they're dancing, they're doing an across the floor combination or whatever it is, and all of a sudden, they're starting to like really cramp up in certain muscle groups, that could be a sign, again, that their body is not coping super well with the stress of the heat. Confusion. So again, this maybe goes a little bit along with some of that like headache, lightheadedness, dizziness, but if they're starting to like kind of like get confused, and this could in like the dance world maybe look like dancers forgetting the steps or like not being able to pick up choreography or just seeming like they're not super sharp and they're, turning the wrong direction or things like that. So it might not be them, not being able to put a coherent sentence together or something like that. In the case of a dancer, if it's, a dancer who normally follows along totally fine, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, they're really like not picking up choreography today, or they're seeming to like struggle and not be able to cope, that could be a sign of confusion. Fatigue is definitely one as well. This is a little bit hard, especially if you have dancers who are dancing, intensively. Fatigue is probably a part of that, regardless of whether they're struggling to cope with heat or not. So I wouldn't necessarily use heat as the one and only marker. But again, if you have a dancer who they're only 30 minutes into a class and they're just like dragging, and you can tell like, they just are really, really fatigued and really struggling, that could be a piece of the puzzle along with some of these other signs and symptoms. And then in extreme cases, if we have somebody who, potentially is exhibiting signs of heat exhaustion and those get ignored and they continue to push and it moves into sort of heat stroke, we will potentially have a loss of consciousness. So hopefully we are recognizing the signs and symptoms before we get to that point. And so we're not getting to that point, but it is certainly something that does happen, and potentially more frequently than it probably should happen, where people will actually faint or lose consciousness because of their inability to regulate their temperature. So like I said, these things kind of occur along a continuum. So we start out being able to cope with the heat, being able to handle it well, and then potentially move into this like heat exhaustion phase. This is where we really, really, really want to be able to identify that this is what is happening, because in heat exhaustion, if we act quickly enough, and we'll talk a little bit more about the things that we can do, if we act quickly enough, we can hopefully halt and then reverse this progression. And so the person can cool down and come back to regular body homeostasis, and it doesn't become an even bigger problem. So we really, as much as possible, want to be able to identify people who might be struggling before it becomes a medical emergency. Because if we don't identify heat exhaustion and kind of act quickly to address that, then it is potentially going to progress into more of a heat stroke situation that may or may not involve loss of consciousness, but it becomes a much more serious medical emergency. And in those cases, it usually requires, or pretty much does require, taking the person to an emergency department and having them be treated medically. And it often involves fluid replacement with IVs and things like that. So as much as possible, we really want to identify at the first signs of heat exhaustion, so that, like I said, we can act quickly, reverse the effects of it, and then not have it progress to something more serious. So if we are identifying dancers who are potentially exhibiting signs of heat exhaustion, we want to stop. We want to pause. We want to stop them dancing, not continue to push through. And this is potentially easier said than done. In a class setting, it's easy. We can, take a break, have a dancer, sit down, whatever it is. But where we sometimes run into issues is in performance situations. And this is maybe where we see more people progress into kind of heat stroke, because performers will push themselves. And if they're performing outdoors or in situations where, the quote unquote show must go on, sometimes they will ignore some of the warning signs. So pausing or stopping the activity is a super important first line. As soon as we identify heat exhaustion, we need to pause, stop, take a break, allow their body to not be exerting itself at such a high level. We want to try and cool this person down as quickly as possible. So that might be using fans, that might be exposing them to air-conditioned spaces, if that is an option, if there's somewhere cooler that they can go in the building. It could be potentially using cold compresses or ice packs or things like that, cool baths. We have to be a little bit careful with some of that stuff because we don't want to shock their system. We don't want to take somebody whose body is struggling to maintain temperatures and all of a sudden cool them off, throw them into, an ice bath, fully submerge them in an ice bath or something like that, because it's usually too sudden of a change and their body is going to struggle to cope with that. So we want to cool them down, but it might need to be a little bit of a more slow, gradual thing. So fans and cold compresses and things like that work really, really well to help to calm down or cool down a person, but not too suddenly. And then we want to focus on rehydration, and we're going to talk about hydration in a second. So making sure that they are replacing and replenishing what has been lost through this heat exhaustion process. So if we have a dancer who we suspect is struggling with some sort of heat-related illness, whether that be heat exhaustion or hopefully not heat stroke, because that, like I said, is a medical emergency, we are going to pause and stop dancing. We're going to cool that person down, and we're going to focus on rehydrating. So those are the three key areas we really want to make sure that we are addressing in those situations. We also, as much as possible, want to try and prevent dancers from getting into this scenario or into this situation. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. I think it's really important for people to understand and be able to recognize signs and symptoms of heat illness. But like I said, if we can actually just do things to address this and hopefully prevent it from happening in the first place, that is even better. So if we are dancing in warmer temperatures and throughout summer months and in hotter places in the world and all of those types of things, there are sort of four key things we want to really focus on to make sure that we are helping the body maintain body temperature as much as possible. So the first one we're going to cover is hydration. And hydration is super, super, super key to dancers, not just when we're dancing in heat, but all the time. Because if we have even a 1% to 2% decrease in hydration levels, we can see decreases in performance. We see that affect both the body, physically, as well as the brain. And so we see these decreases in performance output with just really minimal effects of dehydration. So it's really important for dancers to try and stay hydrated all the time, but even more so when we're dancing in excessively hot temperatures, because if we're sweating, we're losing more of that hydration as we sweat and as we dance in these higher temperatures. And so we have to just make sure that we're more conscious of maintaining hydration levels. So we want to make sure that we are drinking water before, during, and after dance. And this one sometimes can be tricky for dancers if they're not getting a lot of water breaks in classes. And if somebody's dancing at their own home studio, I find it's not as big an issue. But if somebody's in, a summer intensive situation or maybe like a masterclass situation or something like that, oftentimes they are going to wait until they are given permission to go and have a water break. And so as a teacher, you need to be really, really, really aware of have you seen any of these dancers drink? Or are they potentially waiting for you to say, okay, everybody go grab some water? So you as a teacher might actually have to intentionally put in really frequent water breaks, or just at the start of class,
make a statement and say, I want everybody drinking lots throughout class today. The weather's warm. Bring your water bottle to your spot at the bar. Just drink whenever you need to between exercises. Like, give them that permission so that they are not necessarily waiting for you to say, okay, you can have a water break. Because I know the culture in dance, sort of that culture of like respect, and if you're in an environment where you're not as comfortable and familiar with the teachers, those dancers may not be as likely to keep hydrating themselves, even if they, are starting to get really thirsty and they can feel that they need to. They might be a little bit nervous or a little bit scared too. So as a teacher, we really want to make sure that we're encouraging them to drink throughout class, not just before and after, but also before and after class. Also, just like a note for like studios, please make sure that you have somewhere where dancers can like fill their water bottles easily, whether that's like a water fountain filling station or just a sink they have access to, because I've certainly been in studios where dancers will come with a full water bottle, but as soon as they drink it, there isn't really anywhere for them to readily refill it. And that's super problematic if you have dancers who are there for long days. So please, 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 as a studio, make sure that you have some way for dancers to refill their water bottles easily, because they should be refilling them multiple times if they're there for an entire day or in an intensive type situation. And then the last thing I want to say about hydration is we will often use the color of our urine output as a way of telling if we are adequately hydrated or not. Our urine should be sort of a light color. It should be clear. If we are showing signs of dehydration, it will often become a much, much darker color, or sometimes like not as clear, like it'll become a bit sort of cloudy or things like that. If you are interested, there are urine color charts available, so you can just Google it and it'll kind of give you like a gradient. This is a little bit individual to people, so generally like for you personally what your normal is. And so we want to just be paying attention to that. Also, if we are struggling with urine output, that is absolutely a sign that you're dehydrated. So if you've been dancing all day and you've been like drinking loads of water, but you're like, I haven't actually like gone to the washroom in the entire day of dancing, that's probably a sign that you might be a little bit dehydrated. So it is paying attention to urine output, but also color of urine output. We want it to be a light color. So if you're interested, Google it. You'll get these little charts that will show you kind of roughly what that should look like. It doesn't need to be completely clear. I think some people, I don't even know, this was like years ago, it became a thing where it was like, your urine shouldn't be yellow at all. It should be completely clear. And so people started overhydrating themselves. And so we don't want to overhydrate ourselves. That can actually be problematic as well. It's a much less common problem, but it can be a problem. So it should still be a little bit yellowish in color, but it should be light and it should be clear. And so we want to make sure we're staying well hydrated. Number 2, so going along with hydration, is replacing electrolytes. And so electrolytes are essentially the salts in our body, and they're super important for body functioning, all sorts of body functioning. And when we are sweating and when we're working hard, not only are we losing fluid, but we're using a lot of this. This is why our sweat tastes salty. Like if you ever had it like drip down your face or whatever, you know that sweat tastes salty. So we're losing a lot of those electrolytes while we are sweating. And it's really important to replace those electrolytes, because sometimes we can have people who are rehydrating with water, but it's not, their body's not able to like easily absorb it if they have an electrolyte balance going on. And that's when we see this kind of like overhydration levels happening. It might not be that they're just drinking too much water. It might be that they can't balance it with their electrolyte kind of balance. So when we are dancing in extreme heat situations, dancers will pretty much probably always need to replace electrolytes. And so dancers dancing day to day throughout the year in cooler temperatures, they might be fine with just having plain water for hydration purposes. But depending on what level you're dancing at and how sweaty a dancer you are and things like that, some dancers might actually need electrolytes on a regular basis, especially if you have dancers who potentially have any sort of dysautonomia, so issues regulating their autonomic nervous system, so things like POTS and stuff, which is really common in hypermobile dance populations. They may need a lot of electrolyte replacement year round, like regardless of what the temperature is like. But when the temperatures are hot and people are dancing in hot environments, I will go out on a limb and say, this is a very sweeping statement, but sort of say, I think all dancers probably at that point need to be replacing their electrolytes. So this can look like electrolyte drinks, and that's often the easiest way to replace it because we also want to focus on hydration. So you can get, like, most sports drinks will have electrolyte replacement in them. They also have carbohydrates in them, which is great for dancers when they are dancing long hours in summer intensives. So I think sometimes sports drinks get a bit of a bad rap because they're quote unquote high in sugar and dancers are a little bit afraid of them. But if you are dancing long hours, you need to fuel yourself. And the way we fuel ourselves is with carbohydrates, and sports drinks can be a really good way of getting those fast acting carbohydrates, getting the electrolytes we need, and then also getting the hydration at the same time. So sports drinks absolutely is an option. You can also just get electrolyte tablets that you can add to just plain water if that is more interest to you. So you can get electrolytes that are, like I said, combined with the carbohydrates, or ones that are not, potentially if you're getting your carbohydrates from other sources. And we can also get electrolytes from food. So sometimes people will choose to hydrate with just plain water, but then they might purposely eat salty foods. I have a friend, and her like number one kind of electrolyte replacement is adding like salt and other types of things to cucumbers and stuff. Like she really likes the crunchy, like she wants to eat something. So things like that are fine too. We just need to make sure that we are purposely replacing those electrolytes. If this is something that you're like, I think maybe I'm struggling with this, I really highly suggest reaching out and working with a dance dietitian or a dance nutritionist, because this is the area that they really specialize in and can give you individual guidance for your personal, like, how many hours you're dancing and all of that type of thing. So give you really individualized personal information. But in general, we want to make sure we're staying hydrated and we want to replace our electrolytes. And so those are things that should be top of mind for any dancer who's dancing in higher temperatures or hot weather. We want to think about our room temperature. So number 3 on this list of things we can do to try and control things is try and control the room temperature. This obviously is not up to individual dancers. This is up to the teacher or the studio directors or people like that. But the ideal and the recommended kind of quote unquote working temperature for dance studios is 21 degrees, give or take. And that's kind of standard room temperature, 21 Celsius. Obviously, I actually don't know what that conversion is in Fahrenheit. So if you're American, you have to figure that out yourself. But 21 degrees Celsius. If rooms drop much below that, then we're going to have dancers struggling to actually like get warm and stay warm while they're dancing. And when rooms skyrocket like above that in temperature, then we're putting our dancers at risk for some of these heat-related illnesses. A lot of dance studios are hard to maintain temperature control because they are often really big spaces with really high ceilings and things like that. So we want to, as much as possible, open doorways and use fans. And I mean, if you have air conditioning, then that is like the ideal situation. And then some of this becomes not such a big deal because we can keep that room at, say, 21, or maybe it's 22 or 23 degrees, but somewhere in and around that 21 degrees. But the reality is a lot of dance studios don't actually have AC available to them. So we need to, like I said, open doors, open windows, get airflow going through, whether that's with fans, whatever that looks like. And if we cannot maintain the room temperatures somewhere in and around there, like I said, it's maybe not going to stay at 21 degrees, and that's not the end of the world. But if the studios start to creep up above 24, 25 degrees, and we can't actually cool those rooms down, we need to be really careful of what we are asking dancers to do in those settings. So if you have studio space and you're doing everything possible and you're monitoring the temperature and the rooms are still going up to 27, 28, 29 degrees, we then need to start to consider whether it's actually safe for dancers to be dancing, or really adapt what it is we are doing. So maybe our dancers are still dancing in those rooms, but maybe we're focusing on very different elements of dance. Maybe we're using our time to focus on, intricacies of like technique, or doing a little bit more work on the floor that's less aerobic, that's less cardiovascularly demanding. So you really need to think about what it is you're doing if you have a room that you're not able to control in and around that 21 degrees. Like I said, it's not going to stay exactly that, but Certainly when a room starts to get above about like 23, 24, dancers are going to start to notice it and start to feel the effects of like fatigue and things like that. So we need to be careful. And then, if we're getting up near 28, 29, 30, we need to start to consider whether that's actually safe for dancers to be dancing in those rooms and in those studios. And then lastly, we want to think about clothing. So ideally, we want to be wearing loose, breathable clothing, and we want to think about like dressing in layers. So as we heat up or as the day progresses and gets hotter, we want to be able to remove layers so that we are not overheating in what we're wearing. And like I said, loose, breathable clothing is kind of the ideal. So oftentimes in dance, we are wearing very tight, restrictive clothing. So whether that's sort of like leggings or tights or things like that, we might need to consider what our dress code is in really hot summer months, especially, I know it is tradition and the norm for, say, ballet dancers to be in full tights and leotards, but maybe we allow ballet dancers to wear, like to have bare legs and then have like a leotard and shorts or something in the summer instead. And in other styles of dance, if, we don't need leotards and things like that, because I know in other styles that's not necessarily customary, like encouraging dancers to wear looser, more flowing clothing is going to be more beneficial than having like really constrictive tight layers of spandex, which just does not allow the skin to breathe as much as it could. So educating our dancers on that, or if you are a dancer, thinking about your outfits and having sort of layers and then being able to know that those layers are breathable and made out of fabrics that, are more breathable. So generally natural fibers are more breathable than synthetic fibers. Most spandex is synthetic. So something to think about with your clothing, because it does make a big difference if your skin can breathe a little bit more. All right. That is my list of things that we want to think about sort of from a prevention perspective. So we want to think about hydration, replacing electrolytes, room temperature and controlling the room temperature, and then clothing. And then like we talked about earlier, we want to be really, really aware of what the signs and symptoms of heat-related illnesses are and act quickly to reverse the effects of them if somebody is still in that stage of potentially heat exhaustion. But if it does progress to more of a heat stroke situation or their symptoms start to progress, then absolutely it is a medical emergency. You want to get that person to medical help ASAP. I hope this episode was helpful. Like I said, I know there's a lot of people going through some heat waves right now in the summer and dancing through those. So hopefully that gives you some tips and sort of actionable items to keep your eye on and things that you can do to be aware of. And if you are a teacher, really making sure that you put loads of breaks into your day. Like it might even mean having like a little pause between every exercise or between every combo you learn. Like the day might feel like it's moving a lot slower than normal, but that might be totally necessary to make sure that our dancers are not overheating. And then I also I hope that this is obvious, but it may not be. But if temperatures are climbing to rates where it becomes unsafe for people to be doing physical activity, as like a studio director or a studio owner or whatever your title is, it is up to you to cancel those classes. And I don't think you should feel bad about canceling those. I think that your customers and parents and families and whoever it is, they are going to be grateful that you are taking the health and welfare of your dancers, like making that a top priority. And so I think there's a lot of hesitation for people to sort of cancel things and be like, it's just a bit of a heat wave, but it absolutely is a health and safety matter. And so if you know that you can't get your studio temperature down below 29 degrees, it's probably not safe to have kids in there or anybody in there dancing for hours and hours on end. So something to consider, and absolutely I would say do not feel bad about canceling if that is necessary. Heat waves don't usually last for a super long time, so it's probably only going to be a couple of days here and there. But other than that, just adjusting what you're doing from a teaching perspective also is going to make a big difference. So hopefully that was helpful for everyone. If you have any questions, as always, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is in the show notes. You can also reach out to me on social media at dancephysioerica with a K. And once again, thank you so much for listening. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.